Hi, my name's Jack, and I'm a PhD student here at UCL, and I'm based in the Developmental Cognitive Neuroscience group, which is led by Professor Sarah Jane Blakemore. And in our lab, we study the development of the human adolescent brain, and also many of the behaviours that are associated with this period of transition from childhood to adulthood. And adolescence can be defined as starting with puberty and ending when an individual maintains a stable role in society. So obviously, as you can imagine, that can go on for quite a long period for many individuals. And we also like to think of adolescence more broadly as probably starting around the age of 10 and ending at about the age of 24. And adolescents are often stereotyped as impulsive, irrational, and immature, and this is not something that is only limited to the 21st century. Throughout history, conceptions of adolescence and stereotypes of adolescence have been very prominent. And this example here comes from Aristotle, who describes adolescence as passionate and impulsive. But what's particularly interesting about this quote from over 2,000 years ago is that Aristotle is describing adolescence as a time where individuals are more likely to spend a significant amount of their time with their friends. And we like to think of this as a period of significant social reorientation. And by that I mean adolescence or post-puberty is a time where individuals are more likely to explore their social world more greatly. They're more likely to move away from their parents and spend time with their friends or their peers. And this is something that is not only seen in human adolescents, but is also seen in many other species. So chimpanzees, after puberty, are far more likely to spend time with their friends or age-matched peers than they are with their parents. And we also see this sort of change occur in many other species such as mice and rats. What I really want to try and get across in this talk is that adolescence is a really distinct developmental period, and it's a period that is characterized by a constellation of behaviors that are really dependent on the social environment. So this first study that I'm going to show you really conceptualizes that nicely. So in this task, adolescent and adult participants were brought into the lab and they were placed in a particular room. And in that room, there was some alcohol. And the amount of time that these individuals decided to drink the alcohol was recorded. So on the vertical or the y-axis here, you can see the amount of time that these adolescent and adult participants decided to drink. And you can see that there's very little difference. However, the researchers then decided to place these individuals in a different room with their friends. And you can see here that adults don't change the extent to which they drink, but adolescents do. But what is quite striking about this particular study is that participants weren't humans, they were mice. So we can all probably make many sort of similarities with human adolescent behavior here as well. So this leads us also to the question of whether or not there is significant variation across human cultures in terms of traits that we observe during adolescence. And one study that came out last year that was looking at sensation seeking found a really nice trend and a really nice similarity across 11 different cultures. And sensation seeking is a trait where individuals seek out novel or really intense experiences that are in many cases particularly risky. So you can see on this x-axis or the horizontal axis here age and sensation seeking on the y or the vertical axis. And you can see this really nice inverted U shape whereby in adolescence, sensation-seeking peaks and then starts to decline in the 20s and early 30s. And this leads us to the question of whether or not adolescents are, in fact, more likely to take risks than adults. Obviously, if they are more likely to sensation-seek, we might think this. And one way we can look at that is by looking at data that comes from the consequences of real-world risk-taking behaviours, such as driving-related incidents. So this data comes from the Department for Transport report in 2015. And we can see here that the youngest age bracket of drivers, 17 to 24-year-olds, make up 7% of all UK licence holders. However, quite scarily, this group of 7% of individuals account for 85% of all serious injuries that are accounted for by driving. And if we look at this a little bit further, this exact same age group, this 7% of 17 to 24-year-olds, contribute to 25% of all crashes, of all deaths that have occurred when the driver has been over the alcohol limit. So this is 18% greater than we would expect if it was proportional to the number of individuals within that age bracket. But as psychologists and neuroscientists, what we want to do is try and understand this a little bit further and see whether we can work out what mechanisms might be going on in the brain or might be going on psychologically to try and determine why individuals might be more likely to take risks than adults. And one study that was conducted, or initially conducted over in Philadelphia in Lawrence Steinberg's lab, was this one. And what they did was they got adolescent, young adult, and adult participants to come into the lab and play a simulated driving game. And in this particular task, what the individual has to do is drive along a track, a simulated track, and they're given an allotted amount of time. And if they get to the very end of the track, they get a reasonable sum of money. However, along the way, they're presented with some traffic lights. And if the traffic light is red, they have a decision to make. They can either stop and wait and obviously lose time and not get to the end of the track and obviously not reach or get the full amount of money, or they can jump the red light. And if they jump the red light, they might get away and eventually get to the end of the track, or they could be crashed into by another car, meaning that they lose a considerable amount of time and a lot of money. So when individuals were asked to play this on their own, we can see here on the y-axis the number of crashes or the number of risks that the individuals encountered, that adolescents, young adults, and adults take a very similar amount of risks. However, when the researchers decided to get these individuals to come into the lab with their friends and have their friends watch them play this particular task, we can see something particularly different. Adults don't change how risky they are. They incur the same number of crashes as when they're on their own. But adolescent participants are twice as likely to jump a red light or twice as likely to incur a risk. So from a brain basis, what we want to do is try and work out what's going on at the neural level. So if we do this task in a brain scanner, we can try and find out whether there is particular brain regions that are sensitive to individuals when they're either playing on their own or playing with their friends. And one hypothesis is that possibly brain regions that are involved in reward processing are particularly sensitive for adolescents but not adults. So in order to answer that question, individuals will be playing this exact same task in a brain scanner. And this is an MRI, which is very good at taking a structural and anatomical image of the brain, but it's also a really good measure of functional imaging. So we're able to measure blood flow in the brain, which we then assume to be activity in different regions of the brain. So when adolescents are undertaking this particular task in the scanner, we can see activation in the ventral striatum and the orbital frontal cortex, but only when they are being watched by their friends. And this network of brain activity is thought to be related to processing reward or predicting particular rewards in the future. So quite possibly adolescents are feeling greater reward or having greater social reward when they're with their friends. And we don't see this in adults. But what is also particularly interesting is that for adults, but not adolescents, both when they were on their own and when they were with their friends, had activity in the lateral prefrontal cortex. And this is a bit of a brain that's at the front, and it's involved in cognitive control and goal-directed decision-making. So quite possibly adults are making more strategic decisions, and adolescents are making decisions based on the rewarding property of a particular task. So that can't be the only reason why adolescents are more likely to take risks in the presence of their peers. And one study that was conducted in our lab by Lisa Knoll wanted to see whether or not adolescents were more socially influenced by their peers compared to adults. So in this particular task, which had a huge sample of over 500 individuals, it was conducted in the Science Museum in London. They managed to get a lot of people from a variety of different ages come in, and they were presented with different scenarios. One of these scenarios, as I'm showing you here, is crossing a street on a red light. So this is a risky scenario that the individuals then had to rate how risky they thought this was. But then what the researchers did was they showed an average rating coming from either an average group of teenagers or adults. And then the adolescent or the participant was then able to provide a second rating, because what we wanted to do was see whether they would be more likely to change their rating after having seen the thoughts and beliefs of the teenagers or the adults. So what I'm showing you here on the horizontal axis is each different age group that was participating in this particular study. And then on the y, or the vertical axis, you can see that if the bar appears above the 0 line, then it would mean that that particular age group is more influenced by teenagers than adults. And if the bar appears below the 0 line, then we can assume that those, or that particular age group would be more influenced by the thoughts and opinions of adults. And if you see a little asterisk or a star, that basically just means that the result is statistically significant or it's statistically meaningful. So what we can see here is that for children, young adults, and adults, they are particularly influenced by the thoughts and opinions or the ratings that were provided by other adults and not by the teenagers. Mid-adolescents are not particularly sensitive to either teenagers or adults. However, young adolescents are far more likely to be influenced by the thoughts and opinions of teenagers. And this study was replicated in a new cohort of over 500 people again, so we can see this as a particularly robust finding. However, this can't be, again, the only explanation as to why adolescents might be more likely to take risks in the presence of their peers. And I think one thing that is really, really important is social inclusion. So possibly adolescents are far more likely to be sensitive to the fear of social exclusion or social rejection. And one way to study this in a lab setting is to bring people in and to experimentally exclude them from a particular task. So this was a game called Cyberball that was developed about 20 years ago, and it's still used at the moment. And what I'm going to do is just show you an example of an individual being excluded. So these two people at the top are experimentally manipulated by us to exclude this participant at the bottom. And the participant thinks that these two cartoons at the top are other participants in different places or in the lab. But in fact, they're obviously not. They're manipulated by us to either include or exclude them. And before the particular task was, before the participant undertook this particular task, they would provide a mood rating. And they would then provide a mood rating when they were included in this game, and then they would provide a mood rating when they're excluded from this particular game. So what we can see here for adults, so these are the different age groups again on the bottom, and then on the vertical axis, their mood ratings. And their baseline mood rating is in yellow, and then their mood rating after they were included in this ball tossing game is in green, and then their mood rating after they were excluded is in blue. And we can see here that for adults, there is a slight but still significant reduction in mood when they are excluded from this particular ball tossing game. However, for mid-adolescents and young adolescents, this is an even more significant reduction in mood. So we can see that adolescents are hypersensitive to social rejection. And if this particular task is done in a brain scanner, what we can see is that regions of the brain that are involved in social evaluation are particularly heightened when somebody is excluded. And this particular region is the medial prefrontal cortex over in the front of the brain. But what is particularly interesting for adolescents and not adults is that the activity in the medial prefrontal cortex when somebody is excluded is significantly related to individuals' resistance to peer influence. So individuals with higher level of activity in the medial prefrontal cortex are less likely to be resistant to their peers. Finally, what I want to say is that many of the previous experiments that have been done on risk-taking are normally related or normally to do with physical or health risks. And I think that for adolescents, one other thing that's really important is this fear of social exclusion. So if you can imagine the scenario of somebody trying to weigh up the consequences of a health risk, such as being peer pressured to drive really fast in your car or take a cigarette, with the sort of social risk of possibly being ostracized from your friendship group, I think it's really quite apparent that possibly for adolescents, for them, the rational decision might be to take the cigarette or drive a bit faster, because being ostracized for them really does hurt more than it does for adults.